Welcome to our meeting today. As most of you that are operating in the free world right now, you've probably grown quite accustomed to virtual settings to get groups together and interact. And we do appreciate you doing that today under the circumstances that we're operating. So we appreciate you taking time out and taking this opportunity for us to get together and delve into some technical material that keeps us from going so long without any interaction with each other. And you'll see quickly today that we're going to dispense with a lot of the formalities and just dive into some technical material today regarding desired forest conditions and kind of to bring that back to the surface for some of us. And the reason that we're doing that is that as a result of the survey of our CDN membership, i.e. you guys, there was strong interest there. So we wanted to be able to provide that training, and there's several things working together right now that makes this a good time for that. There's several things going on. So we'll have, as a result of the survey that you guys gave us input of what you'd like to see from the CDN, we'll begin that kind of a three-pronged approach with today's webinar, and we'll have Duck Locascio, the LDWF Forestry Program Manager. And Duck, please take time to introduce yourself as we hand things over to you in just a little bit to provide that background for those that might not have been on board when DFCs was a hotter topic than it is right now. I know that I started my career about the time to where, the document had just came out. There was lots of hype around it. And if I look around, if I was honest with myself, there's been a lot of changeover since then. So there's a lot of staff that's moving on to other areas. We've brought a new generation of staff in that was not around during that time. So this today will serve as a good background for that. And there's also some other things happening in that the Forest Stewards Guild has received a NIFWF grant, and part of that is hosting some DFC trainings in the tri-state partnership area. So there'll be workshops coming for technical staff and practitioners in Mississippi and Arkansas, as well as Louisiana. The thought was that we would start that this fall. But at this point, the way things are happening, the possibility for an October get together, that's still in place right now. But we will, so that event is we're heading in that direction. But as with other things, we're likely we'll have to reevaluate that. So stay tuned. But there are training opportunities coming that'll be in the field training on DFCs. And then at our December meeting, assuming that goes ahead in whatever format it in, we intend to do a deeper dive into desired forest conditions and the use of the concepts that are involved in that and the delivery of those practices. So that's kind of so we've got the webinar today. We've got technical trainings coming, and then we hope to do a deeper dive in December at our CDN meeting. So just a little bit of housekeeping as we move forward today. So Duck's presentation is going to be in the neighborhood of 30 to 40 minutes. And then we will have a question and answer session following that. So feel free to use the chat box for that. But other than that, please mute your lines until Duck's presentation is over with. And then we will have a time for a question and answer. We always really encourage active participation during that time. So Steve Brock will take over in operating that question and answer session. So feel free to use the microphone features or the chat box for your questions during that time. But please do keep your lines muted during Duck's presentation. And then if I don't get to remind you again, once I mentioned the Forest Stewards Guild workshops, and along with other partners that'll be presenting, if I don't get to remind you that before we break up today, keep your ear to the ground. We do hope for the CDN to be heavily involved in that. So that membership list that you're a part of will be the forum that we'll do outreach and try to keep everyone informed of when that's happened. So we're hoping for heavy CDN participation there. And then also with the folks that'll be helping to deliver those workshops as well. So Steve Brock, would you add anything to that before we introduce Duck and lift off with his presentation?
Well, I was scribbling some notes. I might have missed it. Did you mention about muting mics? Things seem very quiet right now, which is fantastic, but I have seen a good number of mics that aren't muted, so just be aware of that. But like I say, everything's quiet at the moment, but I wanted to make that point. Otherwise, I don't have anything to add.
All right, thanks. And with that, we'll introduce Duck Locascio, LDWF Forestry Program Manager. And Duck, anything that you would add to your intro, do that as we get started here. So we'll hand things off right now.
All right, so I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Donald Locascio. Everybody knows me as Duck. I've been working for the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries now for 23 years. Started in 1997. And just to give a little timeline, in 2004 is when the JV put together the Forest Resource Conservation Working Group. And then this document that I'm actually going to discuss this morning was published in 2007. And now we're sitting at 2020. So I was fortunate or unfortunate for DFCs to kind of happen right in the middle of my career. So with that, we'll get into, I may not be I'm the least ignorant when it comes to DFC, so I guess I'm the best to give this presentation. I titled it Wildlife Forestry in the Lower Mississippi Valley, AKA Desired Forest Conditions. To me, when I'm talking about desired forest conditions for wildlife, I'm basically just talking wildlife forestry. A lot of what we do and what I discussed today, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries was doing prior to DFCs, and folks in Arkansas Game and Fish were doing the same type of habitat work. But I'll show you how it's changed a little bit. At least now we can talk to each other about what we're doing. So, pause my mouse. All right, so before we get into DFCWs, we must first discuss where and how they came to be. I know most folks on this call are familiar with JVs, and most of the audience are probably members of the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture. But indulge me for a moment, and let's just remind everybody who the LMVJV is and what they do. They're a self-directed, non-regulatory conservation partnership that exists for the purpose of implementing the goals and objectives of national and international bird conservation plans. The last part of that is the important part for this presentation, because with the purpose of implementing national and international bird conservation plans, there's a direct implication to restoration and management of bottom and hardwood forests. We're talking about doing work in the MAV. So we look back to see how it all began. Long history of forest management, in the MAV, but rarely were management prescriptions written explicitly linking wildlife habitat needs to specific forest metrics. So just as I described in my introduction, we were doing a lot of work. A lot of folks, biologists and foresters, were doing a lot of good work in the MAV, but biologists and foresters really couldn't talk to each other because we didn't have a common vocabulary, a common language to discuss. And also the habitat and matrix was more of an art, and there wasn't even anything set up to where you could actually measure these factors that were important to these species of concern. So in 2001, it really came to light that the National Wildlife Refuge System initiated biological reviews. Biologists would say, hey, we need more Swainson's warbler habitat across the MAV. A forester would look at him and say, well, what does that look like? You have no idea what foresters don't even know what a Swainson's warbler is. In 2002, NRCS asked U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for assistance in terms of how to manage blocks of bottomwood hardwood forests being enrolled in WRP. That kind of forced a workshop in November of 2002, and a working group was formed to draft a white paper to address forest management as it related to enhancing wildlife habitat. The white paper subsequently resulted in this document, which was NRCS's WRP Forest Land Compatible Use Guideline in 2004. A lot of folks, this might be, new information, but anybody who was around during that time saw this. It was sent around for review and edits, and this was kind of the first working document and became the first desired forest conditions for wildlife. You might think of it as DFC version 1. At the same time, and what I meant to say was, if you look at the graph, here's one of the very first times that managers began to describe wildlife habitat in forestry terms, in terms of canopy cover or basal area or stocking. At the same time, in 2004, the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture Management Board created an interagency, interdisciplinary working group to further investigate and address forest management as it related to enhanced wildlife habitat. That group was called the Forest Resource Conservation Working Group. The task assigned read, the working group will strive to ensure that conservation actions and programs of the JV partners reflect reforestation and forest management prescriptions and practices that sustain populations of priority birds and other forest-dependent wildlife in concert with sustainable forestry. It was this group of professionals that, when combined, you had biologists, foresters, managers, and researchers. It combined all the disciplines needed to fulfill the task assigned, that charge that was assigned by the LMVJV. Some folks on this call, their name might be up here. This was a pretty large group of researchers, foresters, biologists, and if you're not a member of this group, you probably recognize a lot of these names. It's the folks that are working in the MAV on refuges, WMAs, in that time period, in that 2004 to 2007 time period. The first tangible product that the working group put out there was this report. It was entitled Restoration, Management, and Monitoring of Forest Resources in the MAV, Recommendations for Enhancing Wildlife Habitat. This collaboration would later become simply known as the DFC document. And we still just call it the DFC book or the DFC document. Now we try to remember to add the word wildlife to the end of that and call it DFCWs, because that's what it is. It's desired forest conditions for wildlife. Again, a collaboration of 56 partners, 13 organizations, and there's a list of the organizations that were members of the Forest Resource Conservation Working Group at that time. It was peer reviewed by folks like CFA Forest Resource Technical Committee, Southern Group of State Foresters, Ducks Unlimited Southeastern Region, Nature Conservancy Arkansas, and so on. And then, like I said, published in 2007. The table of contents is basically overviews of Mississippi Alluvial Valley, priority wildlife species and habitat objectives, management of bottomland hardwood forests, restoration of bottomland hardwood forests, forest evaluation and monitoring, recommendations and conclusions. For this group, there's no need for me to discuss the plight or the condition of the MAV. We're all very versed in that. So we're going to just start kind of diving in to this report and start at chapter 2, which is priority wildlife species and habitat objectives. Because it was a report requested by the JV, particular attention, no surprise, was given to priority birds, those being waterfowl, forest interior songbirds, and specifically American woodcock. But we also had sections within that wildlife section, chapter 2, we had sections covering bats, bears, and reptiles and amphibians. Within chapter 2, talking about the habitat needs of these species, each species or species group was determined, the habitat needs of each was determined, and forest metrics were determined for those species groups or species. So for instance, for bats, large cavities, existing large cavities in a forest was important for bats. For bears, large cavities, a dense understory, and hard and soft mass was the important factors. For reptiles and amphibians, coarse woody debris. And then we jump to the birds. For migratory birds, which, mainly in the MAV within a forested habitat, you're talking about wood ducks, it was cavities and hard and soft mass. for forest interior birds, cavities and the structural complexity of the forest was the important attribute for that species or species group. And then for the American woodcock, of course, a nice, lush, heavy understory and a mid-story with high stem density. Many of the habitat requirements of these priority wildlife species could be satisfied by manipulating canopy cover and basal area. That's why we started talking talking basal area and talking canopy cover, talking forestry terms. Being that basal area and canopy cover are the variables which most influence forest structure and therefore wildlife habitat. These variables became the drivers of DFCWs and became the primary factors. This next slide is the table straight out of the book, the primary factors. So this is the heart of the report of desired forest conditions for wildlife. It's a very simple table with 3 columns. You got forest matrix on the left. In the center is the desired conditions. That's the range of conditions you want on the landscape for this group of wildlife we're talking about, which is really disturbance-dependent forest interior wildlife. And then the left column is conditions that may warrant management. It's triggers for management. We're just going to really talk about canopy cover and basal area, and I'll explain why. Canopy cover, that sweet spot or desired stand conditions, this is for stand quality at the stand level, would be 60 to 70% canopy cover, meaning that you'd have 30 or 40% sunlight opening in the canopy coming through to form an understory and a mid-story. Mid-story, we want a 25 to 40% mid-story. For the most part, it kind of happens. If you have 60 to 70% canopy cover and are allowing 30 to 40% light transmission through the canopy, you're going to end up with a mid-story around 25 to 40%, unless that mid-story is made up of shade-intolerant species. Then that mid-story is going to run much higher than 40%, and you'll have to prescribe something to take care of some of that mid-story and get it down. Basal area, the optimum desired stand conditions would be 60 to 70 square feet per acre. And then lastly, you see tree stocking. It's another way to talk about the amount of stems on an acre. Most foresters, myself included, we normally talk about basal area. It's how my mind thinks. But if tree stocking is what you think, the way you think, then it's 60 to 70% stocking, 100% stocking, fully stocked stand. We're talking about something a little bit better than half, 3/4 stocking. And then the right-hand column, of course, are those conditions that may warrant management, those triggers for canopy cover. If it's over 80%, it's probably not in desired forest conditions. And for basal area, if you're greater than 90 square feet per acre, and this is kind of on average across the MAV, there are areas on really good growing sites where your basal area is going to be a little bit higher than this, 110, 120 possibly, but on average about 90 square feet of basal area. That's when you're talking about a fully stocked stand. Basal area is going to be running about 110, 120. You want to bring it back down to about 90 or 60 to 70. Anything over 90, you get a little worried about it when you're talking about providing desired forest conditions. And then I just want to remind us all that population sustainability for these species we're speaking about, it's a function of both landscape quality and site quality. Right now, we're talking about site quality. This is kind of at the stand level, and I'll get into landscape quality in a couple of slides from now. For those attributes which couldn't simply be addressed by manipulating basal area or canopy cover, a set of secondary factors were developed based on the needs of individual species. For instance, for cerulean warblers, that during their courtship behavior, they get up in really tall superemergent trees that kind of little lollipops that stick out above the rest of the canopy, and that's where they set up their territories and males sing from to attract a female. So dominant trees or superemergent trees are very important for that species. For a species like Prothonotary warbler, you're talking about small cavities. So small snags that provide little small cavities, or even stems, live stems that have some lower limbs that are senescing to provide those small cavities. Those are some secondary factors that are important. So to take care of those, this table, which is secondary management factors, there's only 2 tables in DFC, so you don't have to memorize 2. Set up the same way. Forage metrics on the left-hand side, the desired conditions, and then the triggers on the right-hand side, and those secondary factors. So these secondary factors, like I was saying, you may have heard, you can't there's factors that certain species need that can't just be controlled by canopy cover or overstory, overstory canopy cover or basal area. It can't be just provided by those primary factors. So that's where this secondary management factor table came from. And it's for, like I said earlier, cerulean warblers need those pre-emergent dominant trees. The desired stand condition for those would be 2 or more per acre. Understory cover would be around 25 to 40% would be the desired stand conditions for understory cover. For regeneration, and here we're talking about shade intolerant regeneration, you'd like to have 30 to 40% of the area occupied by regeneration, that next stand coming on. We still good, guys?
Yeah, would ask everyone please mute your mic.
All right, so coarse wooded debris, right? Important for those herps. The target for coarse wooded debris is 200 cubic feet per acre. Small cavities, remember those are important for like prothonotary warblers. If they're, we're talking about stuff less than 10 inches in diameter. So yeah, that's owls, woodpeckers, wood ducks, 4 or more visible holes per acre. Large cavities greater than 10 inches diameter, 1 visible hole per acre. And then lastly, standing dead and stressed trees. If it's a stand that is mostly made up of smaller diameter classes, then it's going to be 6 stems per acre. And if it's a stand that has some nice large diameter classes across that forest, greater than 20 inches diameter, then we're looking at 2 stems per acre. So these are those little secondaries. I will warn you that when developing prescriptions and out there practicing this on a landscape, you try to nail down those primary factors, and then you provide these secondary factors if your stand lends itself to being able to provide them. You may not be able to check every one of these boxes, and don't get too hung up on it. Just try to do the best you can. Now, as we talked about, population sustainability is both, a function of landscape quality and site quality. We covered the site quality, and I'll get back on site quality and harp on that a little bit more. But now we're going to discuss landscape quality. To address that, the report addresses landscape quality by making recommendations based on life history needs of those species that we're talking about. And those recommendations are for a forest, which is either a refuge or a WMA or a really large private tract or several private tracts put together, whatever the landscape that you manage is, we'd like to see 70 to 95% of that actively managed. Reason being, to provide DFCs on a landscape, we're going to have to do something. We're going to have to break that canopy open and get light coming through the canopy. It just doesn't make itself. We propose or we recommend 5 to 30% passively managed. Oftentimes on WMAs and refuges, I know these are most often natural areas, little hands-off areas for one reason or another, and it still allow up to a third if you so desire, but at least 5% of your landscapes just keep on growing and get into much older age classes, and over time, get into a really old growth type condition, a couple of our generations from now. But and then the last two are, you never want any more than 5% shrub scrub. This is utopia, right, guys? So if you have a landscape that's made up of a bunch of WRP, young WRP, and it's a lot of shrub scrub, well, that's life. It's just, this is the end game. This is what we're shooting for. We'd like to see 5% or less shrub scrub and at least 10% regenerating. No more than 10% regenerating forest, like a WRP property or a recent clear cut where we're releasing regeneration. We don't want too much early sessional habitat, right? Because we already have a lot of that throughout the Mississippi Louisville Valley. What we don't have is older age class forests in these desired forest conditions. So in the next session, we'll discuss, we kind of covered the priority wildlife species and habitat objectives. Now we're going to start to discuss the management of bottomland hardwood forest. And that management entails managing on thirds, or this philosophy of managing on thirds. And this is kind of the way I think about my landscape and most practitioners that are managing for desired forest conditions for wildlife. So they think of breaking everything up in thirds and having a third of your habitat within DFCW criteria. So that table, you want to, your canopy cover is 60 to 70%. Your basal area is 60 to 70 square feet per acre. Your mid-story is 25 to 40% coverage, and you have a nice understory, well-developed understory of 25 to 40%. That's DFCWs. We never want any more than a third of our landscape in that condition, because, right, there's species that need a dark forest. There's species that need a much more open forest and that lean a little bit more to early sessional type habitat. So we want a third of our forest in DFCs. We want a third of our forest growing into DFCs, something that's recently harvested. So when we put a treatment on the ground, we normally treat it and reduce that base layer, drop that canopy cover down below DFC thresholds and let it grow into DFCs. So it's a little bit leaning more to the earlier or mid successional type stage stuff. And then lastly, a third of the habitat that has grown out of DFCs. It's past DFCs, it's 20 years post-harvest, or it's something that you hadn't got to yet that hadn't been cut since it was high graded in the 60s. And that's fine too. So you want a third of your landscape management or refuge that's well beyond DFCs, more dark forest, more red-eyed vireo, Acadian flycatcher type habitat, right? And that habitat that turkey hunters like to go turkey hunt in, not necessarily what turkeys like, but more park-like. And then, and when we discuss the thirds, and I kind of just touched on this, we're looking for this. That desired forest conditions is kind of this picture. Of that third that's in DFCW condition, we want to strive towards a very structurally diverse forest, diverse in species. You can look in this picture and look at all the different color crowns. There's about 7 or 8 different overstory species in this picture. And, if your forest type lends itself to that, then you want to strive to have as much diversity of species as possible. Diversity in age, diversity in diameter, and then, of course, having those secondary factors if you can. Dominant trees, the regen, 30% of your area having some early shade intolerant regeneration, the coarse woody debris, cavities, both large and small, and then having standing live and dead snags. So this is kind of painting a picture of what utopia would be for DFCs. But remember, only a third of your landscape is going to be in this at any one time. So another point or principle that I'd like to go over is there's no silver bullet prescription. A lot of times when we first started talking, doing workshops and talking about desired forest conditions for wildlife, people say, okay, well, what's that prescription look like? What type of treatment is that? Or they walk into a stand that's been treated. Well, is this a DFC cut? They would love to say. People would ask. And I can understand why, but all silvicultural treatments are used. And there is no one DFC treatment or DFC prescription. We use all of them. And here, this little collage of pictures is just showing you upper left is an individual tree selection. Upper right is a shelter wood. Lower left is a clear cut that's coming back and that was actually artificially regenerated. And then that's a shear working to do just pure group selection harvest. We'll get into this a little later in the presentation, but I just want to make that point. There is no DFC prescription per se. All right, just kind of a reminder, all silvicultural tools are used by forest managers to manage stands towards these primary factors, and these are those. And if you can only remember 2 of the primaries, remember canopy cover and basal area, and it's the same numbers, right? 60 to 70% and 60 to 70 square feet per acre. It's beautiful how that ended up that way. And then during the prescription planning process, managers should also prescribe in ways to ensure that the understory cover is 25 to 40% and that regeneration occupies, shade intolerant regeneration occupies about 30 to 40% of the area. And remember to provide those small cavities, those tall emergent trees, snags when you can, large cavities if they exist. So you don't just go make them, don't get an axe and try to make a hole in a tree, but if you're marking timber, if you're a forester out there and marking the timber and you come across a big wolf tree, it's a big overcut with a hole in it, it broke top, but it's got a little bit of wood left and you think it can make a pulpwood, it's probably more important forego that $3 a ton, what we're getting right now for pulpwood, and leave that big cavity tree on the landscape, leave those large cavities. And in coarse wooded debris, same thing, you know, you try to get the loggers to top trees in the woods so that that debris stays out. If they drag material to the deck, then you try to get them to redistribute the slash back across the stand. So to make sure you have that coarse wooded debris in that treatment area. All right, a couple of principles, and we hit some of them. I just want to reiterate just a bit. There's no rotation or cutting cycle when we're talking about wildlife forestry, right? This isn't pine forestry where we're going to thin at 15 and thin again at 25 or 20 and clear cut at 28, 30. Here, there's no rotation age or cutting cycle. Rather, we enter a stand every 10 to 15 years and evaluate it, and then prescribe the appropriate recommendations to reach DFCs. Primary and secondary factors, O2 tables, are an average across the stand. This is important, and we'll take just a second to go over this. Those factors you don't want on every acre. We want diversity within a treatment area. So think about that as an average over 5 to 7 acres. You want to reach that, but on a given acre, it might be much lower or far above those ranges. It's going to be the average will average out, but that variability acre to acre is very important. And that's kind of what we're trying to produce out there on the landscape. To attain DFCs, disturbance is required. You know, at one time, hurricanes and tornadoes would come through when we had vast landscape in older age class timber, but now we're just islands of timber out there in a vast acreage of agriculture in MAV. And if you're waiting for a tornado to put habitat on the ground, you can be waiting a long time. So we need to get out there and disturb the area. Also, multiple treatment entries are often necessary to achieve DFCs. That goes in the same line as there's no one silvicultural treatment that exists to guide stand development. It's going to be a whole bunch of treatments put together to reach DFCs. You may enter a stand and you're starting with a really good stand and one treatment and you're at DFCs, and that's great. But for most of us working in high graded stands, it's several treatments, and it's 40, 60 years before we're going to move that stand towards DFCs. And then lastly, all the silvicultural treatment tools are available to the land manager to move a stand towards DFCs. And I'm not really here to say which one is best. I'm here to explain that you're going to use them all. So it takes a forester understanding how to manipulate light out there on the ground and what material he's going to move out of the woods to put light on the ground to form the forest structure that I'm trying to kind of outline. So we're going to use all the tools. We've had some successes. NRCS, as members of the LMVJV, adopted the recommendations for management of all the WRP enrolled properties. Ducks Unlimited has adopted these recommendations for all DU easements. LDWF, Arkansas Game and Fish, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service all use these recommendations for management of WMAs and refuges within the MAV. And then also many private landowners have embraced desired forest conditions for wildlife. And one example of that is the Mississippi River Landowner Alliance. Take just a second to tell you about that group. In September 2012, a group of about 50 members of share-owned hunting clubs along the Mississippi River, both in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana, formed an alliance to represent common interests. And those interests range from timber management to political advocacy, but most of them got into it for the timber management side of it. It kind of spawned from a couple of workshops that we had done along the Mississippi River in Arkansas and in Mississippi that prompted just word of mouth, one landowner or hunting club talking to another one saying, hey, I went to this workshop and this is what I heard about. And then they kind of got together and formed this alliance. And there's their objectives. It's basically to just provide a forum of communication to discuss timber management, habitat management, any financial or technical assistance that might be out there, and then advocate. So pretty cool story. And they've all been introduced to date, there's 50 privately owned hunting clubs, and that alliance encompasses 300,000 acres. Their goal is 1 million acres. They've all been introduced to DFCs through outreach workshops that I and many folks that are on this call today have been part of. And currently, many of them follow the guidelines of DFCs, or at least some of the guidelines of DFCs. What it has prompted, it's at least prompted them to talk to their consultant foresters and start to move away from patch clear cutting to provide diversity across the landscape, and do more of using various silvicultural treatments, using individual tree select, group selection, harvest, shelterwood, actually prescribing something more than just patch clear cutting. So that's a really good thing for the species that we manage across the landscape. And then talking about those workshops, so far to date, the Forest Resource Conservation Working Group has put on 14 workshops from 2009 till now. So we normally do 1 or 2 a year. They've been for private landowners. The audience has been forestry consultants. And of course, we've had a lot of audiences that were federal and state staff from Mississippi Department of Wildlife Fish and Parks, Arkansas Game and Fish, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and of course, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. So we've also had some hurdles. I just told you that, where we've hit it out of the park, but we had some hurdles. We've had a lot of criticism from traditional forest management practitioners. Those include consultants, and the reason being is it makes it a little harder to do this type of management on a landscape. It's harder for a consultant as far as how he gets paid. He'd have to really charge by the hour or by the acre for this type of treatment, because it's a lot more time invested in the woods. And you'll see in some subsequent slides, it's a lot of timber marking that's going on. So consultants are a little bit hesitant about this type of management. Patch clear cutting is a lot easier, and I don't blame them. If I was a consultant, I'd much rather patch clear cut. Then you have the even age forestry folks, and this kind of really isn't pure uneven age. We do a lot of even age forestry to provide desired forest conditions, but it kind of leans more uneven age forestry. And then forestry academia has taken issue with some of the things, some of the terminology that we use, because it's not by definition to the T a silvicultural definition. These treatments that we use, oftentimes it's modified, and you'll see that when I get into them. So the solution to those, and that's all healthy criticisms. The solution to that is that an original document was published in 2007. So it's probably time for a revision. So the revision is actually underway right now. And we hope to have that revision out in, late 2001, early 2002. And the revision, this is that same slide showing the contents of the original report. And the revision is going to have these extra yellow highlighted. So for priority wildlife species and habitat objectives, we're going to include game species. Of course, a lot of us that work for state agencies, we've been managing for game species all along. But here we at least going to specify, put game species in there, because that is a priority wildlife species for many state agencies. And also that's what private landowners are interested in. They're really interested in deer and turkeys, right? And this provides some really good wild turkey habitat and some more consistent deer habitat. And then we're going to include management of young stands in the management section, and also talking about the economics of this in that management section. And then lastly, we're going to add the tools, the NRCS WRE tools for assessment and treatment of reforested bottomland stands on WREs. We're going to add that tool to that evaluation and monitoring section. And then we're going to go through all our definitions and make sure that's all right. And then also add any new science that we need to add that, in the last 13 years. So let me hold 1 second. My child was supposed to be quiet. Kids. All right. Excuse me. So sorry. All right. So now we're going to jump right into, and this is kind of the tail end of the presentation. We're going to jump into the actual methods that are used to reach DFCs. And I hope this section shows you that this is nothing new, and it's a lot of what we've been doing on the ground already. And we're going to go over actual treatments. So individual tree selection, individual and group selection, shelter wood, and clear cuts. And I'm going to have just some nice, pretty slides and talk about the habitat it provides. So the first, individual tree selection, that's most often used in well-stocked, relatively uniform stands. So your stand is nice, uniform distribution, and it's well-stocked. If that quality is good and it's made up of multiple species, normally a younger stand, then individual tree selection is just used as a general crown thinning. If the quality is poor and species diversity is low, oftentimes in older stands, then we use individual tree selection to thin heavier. So it's still a thinning operation, but we're going to thin a lot heavier to either establish or advance regeneration that's already existing. And here's just some pictures of that. Here you go prior to harvest, and this timber is marked with individual tree selection. As you see, from a wildlife standpoint, understory is really clean. There's no understory at all. Mid-story, probably made up of mostly shade-tolerant regen, and then the overstory is a closed canopy forest. This is going to take, but it's uniform, and the quality is pretty good. So it's just going to be a general thinning across that stand. Prior to harvest, this is really good Acadian flycatcher red-eyed vireo habitat, and you want some of this, right? But we need a third of this in DFCs. So we, the habitat here is limited. Swainson's warbler, Kentucky warbler, and hooded warbler habitat is really limited. So we mark these trees, and once those trees are removed, I'll show you the same stand after harvest. So this is 2 years post-harvest. We're now growing into DFCs. We're developing a mid-story. We're developing a pretty nice understory, nice lush understory. And in this next slide, you'll see with that lush understory comes nesting cover, which provides important habitat for probably the most important priority species, at least in my DFC manual. So we also have the next type of treatment would be individual tree group selection harvest. This is used kind of 3 different times. This is used in areas of good quality and stocking, and areas of poor quality stocking. You just thin the good, and then you use group selection. You think of group selection as like little mini baby clear cuts, 1/4 acre clear cuts, 1/2 acre clear cuts. You just go ahead and clear cut or group select in that where it's poor stocking. And most of the time, you're going to have some regeneration present in that poor stocking, because if it's poorly stocked, there's light coming through the canopy, and there's probably regeneration present. Then it's also used when overstory is manageable and desired regeneration is kind of fading out. You're going to thin through that manageable overstory. And then when you come to any regeneration, you're going to release it with groups. And then lastly, when overstory species diversity is low, but the regeneration is more diverse, we're going to go ahead and thin through that low diverse overstory and then do a lot more group selection, a lot more little small clear cuts whenever we find that regeneration to release it. So here's some shots of group selection. This is a shot from on the ground, recently harvested. You're basically standing in a group. There's a little scope of trees that have been thinned through, and then in the background through that screen of trees, you can see another group. And then this is a shot, get a little better understanding from the air, same stand, individual tree selection on the left and the right of the screen with some groups. You know, there's 2, maybe 3 groups that you can see in the center of the screen. This makes really fine habitat, and wildlife habitat. This is sound timber management, but it really makes some fine wildlife habitat. And what you end up with after harvest, these groups fill in with advanced shade intolerant regen, hopefully, and become really excellent escape cover, nesting cover spots. Then our third treatment type is group selection. This is pure groups. So these little small clear cuts, if you will. Habitat and stand conditions are generally good, and you don't really want to thin across the entire stand. You would just do group selection. It provides these patches of early sessional habitat, and you're able to, we mostly use it when you have advanced regeneration, shade intolerant regeneration, oak regeneration, out there in the forest, where you just go and make little groups where that regeneration is present and release it. Here, that's the same picture that I showed you earlier. Skidder actually making one of those groups. That blue paint you see is the perimeter of the group, and he's just cutting everything inside. And here's a shot when you're standing in a group looking up. It's that, so you get one nice big canopy gap. And The release regeneration quickly responds, provides excellent nesting habitat and foraging habitat for interior songbirds, as well as, you know, really good diurnal woodcock habitat. Where did I lose you this time?
You're showing images of group selection as a
Okay.
practice.
Good deal. I'm so sorry.
That's okay. You're able to get back quickly.
All right. Screen's being shared again.
Yep.
All right. And was this the picture we left on?
No.
We didn't get to that picture, Duck. You were talking about that picture, but it didn't show up because you were frozen.
I got you. All right. So y'all saw this, talking about just the sizes of the gap. So here's the group selection being harvested. Here's the just showing that it's a pretty large canopy gap. And then just showing it at release regeneration that you're releasing. And that's why you prescribe this type of treatment. You're going to put these small groups, these little baby clear cuts, if you will, where there's advanced, you know, at least 3 foot tall, shade intolerant regeneration. That regeneration will quickly take that opening, and it provides excellent nesting, foraging habitat for songbirds, really good woodcock habitat, diurnal woodcock habitat. And then if you're a turkey hunter, and that's probably where I lost you, because they always try to bleep me out when I start talking about turkeys, but mute me. But from a turkey standpoint, if the forest conditions lend itself to just pure groups, it makes primo turkey habitat, because if you think about it, you're not thinning. There's no individual selection between groups. So that forest is untouched. So it's still pretty shady. And then you have these little spots all across that stand that have this early sessional habitat, real lush. It's really good nesting habitat. And then it's kind of a feathered edge because you have diffuse light on the edge of these openings. And then it turns into, so that's really fine brood rearing habitat. And it's areas that a hen can see predators and all she does is putt one time, and they have this group to fly right into when a Cooper's hawk, you know, swings in under canopy. So it makes really fine wild turkey habitat. And we'll get off of that, or I'll talk for another hour. Now we'll jump to shelterwood, and we're closing up, guys. I know I'm running a little long with these mess ups. I was losing you with the internet, but we got 2 more to discuss, and they're pretty straightforward. We use shelterwood treatment oftentimes. It's mainly used to regenerate the stand. In the classic case, you shelter wood to advance, to move regeneration up and kind of get it sapling size. And then you come in and you remove the shelter wood, the overwood. We kind of modify that a lot in the MAV. We use it to, the second bullet, we use it to release regeneration that's already present and competitive. And the overwood most oftentimes is retained indefinitely. That way we end up with a 2-layered canopy, and we're able to mark and retain some of those secondary factors. Like we can retain some trees that have snags, cavities. We can retain big mass producers. We can retain some species that are kind of a little off-site to keep our species diversity high. So that's kind of the difference. And this next picture will show you kind of when I use it. So this is a shelterwood harvest. There was a good bit of regeneration present, a couple of storms that come through, and the canopy was kind of broke up and wasn't all that great in this little stretch. And so we marked leaf trees like 12, 15 per acre. So it constitutes a shelterwood. And the trees we left were the most vigorous, high quality, biggest crowns we could find. And we cut the rest and released a lot of regen. And then here's not the same stand, but a similar stand. Something very similar was done. What you end up with from a habitat standpoint is 2 to 5 years post-harvest, you end up with, you know, kind of early sessional habitat underneath that canopy, underneath that overstory that you left. But it's still kind of scrubby. So you got yellow-breasted chats and indigo bunnings and painted bunnings and common yellowthroats. And in 5 to 10 years post-harvest, it's getting up 15 feet tall over your head, high stem count. It becomes Swainson's warbler habitat and Kentucky warbler habitat and really good woodcock habitat. So that's kind of shelterwood. And then lastly, we talk about clear cuts. These are also used to regenerate a stand, generally used when you have very low stocking or very low quality. We don't use a lot of clear cuts, just carte blanche, but we prescribe a lot of clear cuts because we have a lot of timber that should be clear cut. It's time to start over because it's so poor. And I'm going to show you an example of that. So it's used to release advanced regeneration under a very low quality overstory, or it's used for species conversion. And that's what I'm about to show you. So this was a species conversion candidate. This stand, when I cruised it, it's a couple of 100 acres. And when I cruised it, it was running 90% sugarberry. I mean, you can see this one box elder in the front right-hand side of the picture, but it's basically, it was pure sugarberry. It had been high graded over and over, had a lot of ice damage in it. So it was sugarberry that had a lot of top damage and rock coming down from the top. The stem size wasn't all that exciting, you know. Average diameter was 12, 14 inches. It just a pretty poor stand. And that's a candidate. It doesn't matter how many times you go do individual tree selection and group selection and get as creative as you want in this type of stand. You're not moving this stand towards DFCs with 20 entries. So it's time to start over. My internet cable is unstable, so I'm gonna move on. So here's a shot of it from the air. And you can see that the planet, we actually use artificial regeneration to regenerate this stand because it was all sugarberry. Of course, we're going to get a lot of sugarberry seed that's going to come in too. So we planted, I think we ended up planted, 3 species of oak, ash, maple, American elm, and then we're going to catch a lot of sugarberry. And then no surprise what we end up with, a few years post-harvest. Man, it's lush, early sessional habitat, a lot of soft mass. Important, it's an important attribute across that landscape. You want to have some of this across the landscape. But whenever you prescribe clear cuts, you know what happens after about 7, 8, 9 years, 10 years down the road, it gets pretty clean underneath. It's a high stem count. So, you know, it kind of appears to be some decent Swainson's habitat maybe, but it's really growing out of that. And you end up with these kind of stands, and you just have to know that we're gonna live with, you know, some pretty poor wildlife habitat for another 10 or 15 years until this can either be pre-commercial thinned or reaches a commercial size that it can be thinned or chipped. And then we'll start moving this stand one treatment at a time towards desired forest conditions for wildlife. So get to the end of the presentation, and I'm leaving it with 2 more slides to kind of give you a what DFCs look like, at least in Duck's mind. And this shot from the air, you know, shows that by using all the tools that we can use, we're trying to strive for a structurally diverse forest. You can see all those canopy gaps. That's diverse in tree species. You can see those different crown colors, different size classes, different growth forms. With a heterogeneous canopy, we want a contiguous hardwood canopy, but we want it comprised of a lot of gaps and a lot of complex layering. And not on just 1 acre, you know, not all the same on each acre, but kind of over 5 or 6 acre average. And then this last picture shows you, you know, kind of what I think of when I think of desired forest conditions from the ground. You know, that overstory canopy cover is 60 to 70%. It's going to let that light through to where you're going to have a mid-story of about 25 to 40%. You have an understory of that same range, 25 to 40%. And if you look at this picture, there's some other things that stand out. You see a shade intolerant sapling that's coming on. You see a really large tree on the right-hand side, bracketed by a much smaller stem. In the distance, you see kind of a crooked tree that was probably kept because it had a cavity or something for some reason, or maybe it was laden with vines. So that's the habitat you're looking for on, remember, a third of your property. You'd like a third of it to be more closed canopy dark forest, and a third of it cut a lot heavier than this, leaning more to the early sessional side of things, moving into desired forest conditions. And with that, I'll take questions.
Fantastic. Really good, Duck. Appreciate you sharing with everyone. That was an excellent overview. Obviously, we had to fight a little bit of technical difficulties, but we went through it real smoothly, so we appreciate it. I know we're on an hour, but we're certainly, for those of you who want to stay on and participate, we want to have a hopefully robust and good quality Q&A session just to share some thoughts, ideas, and get Duck to answer any questions if you have any. So there's a couple on the chat board, but before I jump to that, I just wanted to open the floor and see if anybody had an immediate burning question they want to share.
Hey, David, Duck mentioned the revision of the document. You might want to share very quickly with the folks that it's through a NIFWF grant. You might want to share who the actual funders are that provided the money to NIFWF, and maybe more importantly, a timeline on when we think the revision is going to be complete.
Okay, but that I guess conversation is is happening right now. I guess everything is pointing towards that there will be everything is pointing towards the fact that a funding request to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is being favorably considered to fund a revision of the DFC document to do exactly what Duck outlined in his presentation. And so the thought is, and Duck in the heat of talking through his presentation said it would be delivered in 2001 or 2002. That's actually 2021 or 22 is likely when that will happen. And that funding will actually, as I said, that funding request has been sent to the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and so those funders that are involved in that, NRCS is a player in that, as well as the Walton Family Foundation is involved. And Ron, I'll need you to jog my memory about the rest of the folks that are in play there that have interest in seeing this go forward, as well as all the other things.
Yeah, I think the third funder was International Paper. You know, they've got some strong interest in the Valley, and they've been supporting NIFWF, and I'm pretty sure they were supportive of this proposal.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm sorry, I forgot them, but yeah, NRCS, Walton, and International Paper is definitely folks that are channeling funding into the NIFWF coffers that are likely to fund this revision of the document that Doug outlined.
Great.
Hey, Duck, I got a question for anybody in the group. This is Jim. Has there ever been a sort of a forest economics analysis looking at DFCs in terms of going through the full DFCW framework versus a 100% commercial bottomland hardwood framework? What are you losing economically, but what do you gain back from kind of the recreational land market and sort of the other values that you can get back through DFCWs? I'm just curious, when you discuss this with landowners, if there's any information that kind of helps inform those kinds of discussions.
No, great question, and definitely not the first time it's been asked. The shorter answer is no. We haven't had anybody sit down. We came close to actually funding some research to look at exactly that, to look at what the trade-off was from foregoing pure commercial, and could you pick that up with what you would expect to be a little bit better wildlife habitat, therefore maybe some higher lease rates for properties managed this way. But to answer your question, no, and that's what we hope to add to the revision. Although that little piece of the puzzle is going to take a forest economist and a little bit of money probably to do that for us. None of us are qualified to make those. I can give you my gut feeling, but I don't have any hard data. It's just the habitat and the treatments I'm discussing is what I've been doing on management areas for 23 years. And on private property, I've giving a lot of private landowners recommendations because wildlife is kind of their primary and not necessarily timber revenue. And I will say with kind of the way things are right now in the Southeast with pulpwood prices, I mean, hell, you're probably making a lot more money on leases anyway than you are cutting hardwood and sending it to a mill. Although hardwood saw timber prices are actually pretty good right now. But the short answer, and not to get too long-winded, is no. But I'd love to have that answer for folks because it's asked very often.
That's good. Well, the other thing I was just going to overlay on that economics question is people going into the DFCW. I mean, there has to be a carbon lift when you move into this, and if there's some way to quantify that, that's another potential pretty big incentive to landowners to move into this framework if they can monetize their carbon and get into a working woodlands sort of a framework.
For sure.
Good question, Jim. Anybody else? Got a question that Rob Smith put on the chat board asking about consideration of invasives when y'all do treatments.
So it's always a part of it, and it also depends on where you're at. So we don't have, our number one invasive is Chinese tallow tree. We also have issues with common privet or Chinese privet. But I guess Chinese tallow tree is the number one invasive that we worry about. And it all depends on if there's a seed source around. There are areas in the southern part of our state where every time we do a treatment, we know we need a whole money back for to do some invasive species control, some CSI work on Chinese tallow. We may be doing it on the front end, trying to get those seed producers dead before we open up the canopy, or we might be doing it on the back end, getting a hand crew in and foliar spraying. But and then there's other areas in the state where it's not an issue, where the seed source just isn't there for Chinese tallow tree, so it doesn't seem to be a problem. But always has to be in the back of your mind. You need to be thinking about it, and it can be a deal breaker in some regards if you have a lot of tallow across the landscape, and not so much within your forested habitat. When you put light on the ground, it's probably coming. But to not do something, I guess I've had these exact conversations with my foresters, especially one particular forester that works in the central southern part of the state where he's scared to do treatments. But you can't let invasives handicap you from doing management, because it's more important to get that wildlife habitat, that forest structure on the ground that we're looking for. So if it means holding back some funds or finding some funding to get in there and take care of it, then that's what you have to do. And you're managing that. You're never going to get rid of Chinese tallow. You're just trying to control it to some degree. Privet's the same way, but if you get in there beforehand, you can solve your privet problems pretty good, especially if you got a decent deer herd. If you can get it down in where they can reach it, get those older trees injected before it's treated, and then when you open up the canopy, deer will keep the privet mowed down for you pretty good.
Yeah, and sort of a related question that Troy Malik offered is what some people might consider a native invasive is palmetto. He's asking about palmetto management considerations related to that. Would that be something that would be incorporated in the revision?
It might not be a bad idea to have a section on invasive species. We never discussed it before, but it wouldn't be hard to add at least a couple of pages on it. Only a few areas do we have issue in Louisiana with palmetto. And we have not done much to work on dealing with palmetto. It hadn't been a major issue for us on most of our WMA.
Other questions?
All right, so this is Miles. I have a quick question. Earlier in your slides, you mentioned something about having that down woody debris. And maybe if you had a logger out there, you're doing an operation, you wanted to move some of that woody debris around and create that, on the forest floor. In kind of related to the project that I'm working on in wetland reserve easements, and some of the NRCS guys might be able to help me out with this, but I was curious. I think I read a few years ago that in wetland reserve easements, you weren't allowed to leave any treatment that was done in a wetland reserve easement. You couldn't leave any slash anywhere. So can someone shed some light on that, just out of curiosity?
That's not going to be the case on the leaving slash on the wetland reserve easement. It's understood that it's going to be a byproduct of any treatment that is deemed compatible with enhancing the function and values of the wetland. So and it's also one of the things that, especially working in plantations, that with those artificially regenerated stands, that's one of the big factors that's missing from those stands is the coarse woody debris component, because you're going essentially in some cases from a field situation to that's some of your justification for your first treatment is being able to provide that component.
Okay, thank you.
David, this is Kevin Nouns. I think where that confusion comes into play is exactly what David said. Down woody debris is important from a WRP standpoint, and it's something we want. It's something that we actually strive to put onto the landscape. But CRP is looked at differently, and there's been a lot of back and forth in CRP on slash and treetops and that kind of thing, and how they want it on the landscape. So I think some confusion comes in place there because of both programs looking the same and both of them being an NRCS program, so to speak. So definitely we want it on WRE, WRP, CRP is different depending on the state, the contract, those kind of things.
Okay.
Any other questions?
I guess I could add one more, Duck, and I guess you could shed some light on this as well. So in those group selections in any of the stands that y'all treated, when you put in the groups, is it better to orient them kind of a little bit longer east and west if you want a better light response, or is it pretty much just a straight circle?
Yeah, so to answer that question, and I'm not saying we haven't done that and actually thought about that, same way folks put in food plots. But for the most part, we let the advanced regeneration, what's there on the ground, dictate the size and shape of that group. I rarely force a group, to where, okay, it's time for me to make a group and I'm gonna make a circle or a square. Generally, we find that advanced regeneration, and when we talk about advanced, we want it up, higher than waist high. You don't want it up to about your chest. The shade intolerant advanced regeneration. And if you find it and the stem count's there and you want to release it, then you start marking every stem, every merchantable stem where that regeneration is, and you let that regeneration dictate how big it is. Sometimes it's just a little patch, size of a dinner table, so you just might make a quarter acre, to encompass that little spot. Sometimes it might be on a ridge. Oftentimes in the MAV, it's because of elevation changes, right? So the overcup normally always germinate right where that water line last fell out because those acorns float. Willow oak is generally going to be up on the ridges. Water oak is normally going to be up on the ridges and the side slopes. So a lot of times it is linearly oriented. So you end up with these kind of long, linear, meandering groups that might be, could be up to a couple of acres in size. But, rule of thumb, they're acre-ish. But the shape is normally all a function of where that regeneration is present. And it's almost never a perfect square or a perfect circle.
Okay, thank you.
So do you feel comfortable, Duck, that you know, as an example, you gave a 1/4 acre release of a small patch of regen. That's adequate for that to develop.
Who knows? That's a highly debated topic. Maybe if I'm here for another 23 years and I'm long enough to watch something that I released grow up and become salt timber, then I could definitively answer that. But you know, we hadn't had a lot of research looking at gap sizes in releasing natural regeneration in a natural stand of mixed species in the MAV. It hadn't been done. And so we just go by what we see. Every time we do a treatment, you know, we're normally going to go in 2-3 years post-harvest and evaluate it, and then get back in there another, you know, 10 years down the road and evaluate it. You know, at 15, we're normally entering this stand again to evaluate it for another treatment. But we're reviewing what was prescribed and looking at the results. And for the most part, you know, I find if you give it a big enough hole, yes, a sapling, one sapling, you know, if you got a little regeneration the size of the table and you give it a 1/4 acre hole, you're going to give it that hole for maybe 10 years. 10 years later, you're going to be back in the treat again. It's going to need more light. So no, it's not a one shot and done. You're going to give it enough light to grow, but it's definitely enough to move it up to that seedling to a sapling. And then next time you're in, you make that hole a little bigger to release it to where it'll get pole size. Next time in, you're going to feed it a little bit more space and move it up into pulpwood and then saw timber. That's the idea. So I know I didn't answer the question, but I gave you a lot more to think about, I guess.
Seth Swafford asked a question about, I think you may have answered it on size. I mean, you've talked about some of the varying sizes of group selections, but I kind of thought when I saw that, something else I was thinking, I don't really know if you talked about the percentage. You know, when you go into a stand, you're doing a treatment on whatever the forest block size is, how do you decide outside of regen? Is that the only driving factor? Or do you use group selection just to create structural diversity? Right. And percentage do you apply when you do that?
Okay. So, and why folks will sometimes get confused. So to answer your question, no, I don't generally prescribe group selection or individual selection with groups just to provide structure. In a mature stand, in a mixed species, you know, 40-plus-year-old stand because there's normally no need to. Within a compartment, say I enter a 1,000-acre compartment, it just happens to be, you know, a piece of real estate that's bounded by, you know, a creek, a road, and a ditch and a highway, whatever. It might be made up of a couple of stands, 2 or 3 stands that you can delineate and say, hey, there's something different about these spots. In general, one of them might need to be thin. One of them may need some groups because there's regen present. So I normally get the diversity because the landscapes that I work in are fairly diverse. They're starting, you know, if you start with something that's diverse, then you're going to be prescribing pretty diverse treatments. Where we start actually using group selection when it has nothing to do with regeneration is when we're talking about young stand management. So get out of everything I discussed today in this presentation, start thinking about older WRP plantations, WRE plantations that are in that pre-commercial size class or just getting into commercial size class. We oftentimes do prescribe group selection strictly to shake up, you know, just to increase some diversity, just to get some structural diversity, because you have a very homogeneous, you know, trees are planted in rows and perfectly spaced. So we're going to go ahead in and just prescribe group selection. We're going to thin, or we might it may just be groups, and depending on how many trees per acre you're trying to remove, about half the stems. Anytime you enter a young stand, you're going to prescribe, depending on what size groups you're going to deal with, you prescribe the appropriate number to remove, number and size of groups to remove about half the stems. You do that to, like you were asking, just for, you know, to increase that structural diversity and thin that young stand. But no, I don't do it in a natural, multi-species, mature stand. I let the regeneration drive that ship. We never try to work against what the forest is giving us. As forest practitioners and biologists that are actually carrying paint guns too, and they know the wildlife habitat they're trying to produce. We let the forest dictate where that group goes, or where we're just thinning, or where we're not going to do anything. We actually just walk through and leave it untreated. And we do that constantly across a stand, and most of the time use several silvicultural techniques across that same stand. And when you're done, after it's thinned, it makes some really high quality wildlife habitat because of that diversity you're putting on the landscape.
Gosh, I don't know if I missed anything because my computer shut down. I had to get right back in. Have you been talking the whole time?
I've been talking the whole time, and I answered your question twice and then got off on another tangent. So we're good.
All right. So I'm not sure if I've covered all the chat questions. For some reason, my chat box is now blank. Any other questions somebody wants to pose?
So one of the questions from James is, what is the present cost per acre for artificial regeneration in the LMAV?
If anybody's got some better figures than I do, I mean, I can pull something out of my left brain, but I have not dealt with and don't deal with the reforestation end of things. I got a guy for that.
Yeah, I would think WRE plantation cost would be probably a good standard. What is the number for just the tree part of that? Kevin, Alec.
So I don't guess I understand the question. If you're asking for a number for natural regen?
Yeah, artificial reforestation, which is, the same as WRE reforestation fundamentally.
So artificial, right now we're looking at 140 an acre tree planting, 40 an acre site prep.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking in terms of artificial regen and established forest stands. I mean, versus WRP, where you're, taking some marginal ag ground out. I mean, generally we budget about $300 an acre on site prep, which would be ripping and any other kind of prep work we got to do, and then planting the trees and the planting. I was just curious if there was some numbers or anybody had it for actual established forest stands where you need stand calls for artificial regen. So that's what I was trying to get at.
This is Alec. It probably costs you around 150 or something. But I mean, you could double that. It depends on what kind of seedlings that you use.
Right. Probably all very.
I think that
Okay, about 150 then. Okay. Thank you.
It's a bigger question for the group, Jim, of people, and I guess starting with Duck, as he's our technical professional on the call, about just the perspective on utilizing that really would be artificial regen, but interplanting in treated stands, and that I think that's fundamentally what Jim's talking about.
Yeah, so there's two things. A couple of slides I showed, which was just pure clear cutting, where we're going to go ahead and plant, at least 302 per acre. In that case, we planted 435, and that's going to be no different than your seedling costs and your planting costs. There's no site prep. The only site prep we did was burn a few piles off, and for the most part, you're not even going to have to worry with that. So, my knee-jerk figure in my head, I was going to say $150 to $200 an acre. Now, the second part of that question, or what Brock just asked, was interplanting. And we did do some of that in a stand where we don't have natural regeneration. It's a low quality overstory, and we're going to thin it pretty hard. And we would like to see, you know, we're trying to regenerate that stand, right? But if the species diversity is already low, and it's mostly shade intolerant species, you know, sugarberry and maple, little elm, not much oak, then we have in the past, and we often prescribe supplement planting. And that's normally going to be, you know, less than 300 to the acre, more like 200 to the acre. Not necessarily, you know, we just show up with the seedlings, have a planting contractor, hand planting contractor out there, and we fill up the bags and we let them just go. And, you know, it's pretty wide spacing, and they miss a lot of spots and they get tight in areas, but it ends up pretty good. You know, pretty natural type way of planting. And we know we're getting this many trees on that many acres, and normally around 200 trees per acre. And in that case, you know, no more than $150 an acre. It's pretty easy walking. You don't have to do any site prep. You do it before thinning. So, and it's generally, you know, pretty closed canopy. And we've done that a lot on our WMAs. And but that figure, you know, never going to be over. Again, it's just seedling costs and planting costs, and you're going to plant less than 200 per acre. So, you know, you can get it done for maybe $125 an acre.
So I was a little confused to clarify Jim's point, and I really missed it, Duck, in your presentation. But you're basically saying when you did the sugarberry clear cut, y'all went back in with 430. Y'all went in with a straight 100% 435 per acre. How did you deal, or did you do anything to deal with the coppice regen behind that from the sugarberry?
We didn't do anything, and that's the reason why we went with 435. No big deal to throw in, you know, another 100 seedlings per acre. It's not that much higher cost, but because, you know, we couldn't burn it, we're not going to go spray it. I'm not going to bring a helicopter and spray it because there's still good stuff out there. That particular site is not prone to flooding, so you couldn't count on cutting the stumps low and then getting a couple of floods on top of it to kill the stumps and not have the coppice. So knowing we're going to have the coppice, that's the reason why we planted 435 other trees in sugarberry. It was basically, we competed the coppice by planting heavy. And, you know, that stand now is pushing 15 years old, and it's probably half the stem count is sugarberry, but the other half is made up of oak and ash and elm and maple. So we vastly improved that stand condition. And then the next time, you know, the first time in to do a commercial thin, you know what we're going to do? We're going to beat up the sugarberry as much as we can, and to release the planted stock. So that's kind of that plan behind that sugarberry clear cut.
Good question. Anybody else?
I guess a comment on part of Duck's presentation. He mentioned that that as we deploy this style management on private lands, we definitely need to bring consultants into the fold as these trainings come up to do some outreach to them to try to have them attend. But we need to be very upfront to the landowners that we're working with and the professionals that we have a chance to work with, that it's going to call for a change in business model. We're going to prescribe treatments that's barely going to justify mobilization in some places, and that doesn't fit well with the typical business model of a forestry consultant, with them drawing a percentage off of what is taken off of the property. So there's going to be a change in business model call for. Not that it's going to be any not worth their while, but it's going to have to translate into them being compensated by the acre or by the hour for the work that they're doing. So not far into the conversation as we're selling this type management, we need to give our answer for making that transition and what it's going to take for a practitioner to be able to deliver this product.
Yeah, and so that ties to a question I thought about, Doug, when you were presenting about particularly private consultants. because there is some growing interest amongst private landowners in the practice. How do you deal with, you know, or what can you share with the group if they had a private landowner that was interested in implementing DFCWs, and there wasn't an agency professional available to assist them? Can you provide any advice, guidance, list, direction on private consultants that are up to speed and willing to utilize this practice or this approach?
Yeah. Yeah. And we probably need to have another forestry consultant workshop and get a list of names together. We did in the past, and this is maybe 10 years ago or so, 8-10 years ago, but Martin Blaney with Arkansas Game and Fish put together a workshop, a 2-day workshop, and he basically invited all the forestry consultants that worked in the Delta, Mississippi Delta and Arkansas Delta, to come over, and I think we did it at White River, but and we had a 2-day workshop, and it was the idea behind it was to introduce them to this, to where if and when private landowners, you know, there was a demand for this type of habitat treatment, they at least know what we're talking about, and that we'd have a list of consultants that at least knew how to put this type of habitat on the ground. In fact, day 2 of that workshop, we actually had the consultants with paint guns on their back, and it was at White River. Now that I'm thinking about it, it was a stand that Jeff Denman was actually working on, had a prescription for. We actually had consultants marking the timber, and as a couple of us instructors walked around and just explaining to them kind of the little nuances and how what we're doing might be a little different than what they've been doing. And then we had some conversations. All of them, we had long conversations about how, you know, they would probably have to make it work for them. They'd have to be paid instead of by a percentage of the sale. They'd either have to be paid, you know, by the hour, the acre, or a combination of percentage of the sale and per acre. So we kind of started doing exactly what you're asking me, and then, you know, not that it petered out, but either there was enough consultants out there that take care of that desire, or they have found a state agency guy or a federal agency guy that could help them or point them in the right direction. I know, for instance, Jeff Denman, he's now retired. I mean, that's what he's doing now in his retirement. He's making a living managing, you know, DFC type style management on private land. And I know a handful of others. So, you know, if you had that landowner that needed assistance, I have a short list of consultants that can provide that, but I think we probably need to have another, just like David said, have another consultant workshop to where we can introduce this, and it's just ecological forestry. A lot of these guys, they're going to understand it. It's not some alien thing. And this type of treatment, this is happening not just in the Mississippi Delta, in MAV. I mean, this is happening throughout the southeastern United States right now. It wasn't that long ago, Forest Stewards Guild had me in South Carolina giving a presentation on this style of management, and we were just calling it ecological forestry because it's kind of a wave. In the last decade, there's been a wave for ecological forestry or wildlife forestry or near nature forestry sweeping the southeastern United States.
Excellent. One thing I do recall before my chat box cleared when my computer shut down is Tommy, you indicated that you or one of the staff members had a question that's still out there.
Steve, the question was how many MAV WMAs presently practice DFCs for wildlife?
Yeah, so I can answer that for Louisiana, but in the MAV, talking about WMAs and refuges, because all the refuges do, I don't know how many WMAs Arkansas Game and Fish has. I know Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fish and Parks are managing, I know some stands are being managed under this type of, you know, wildlife forestry philosophy. I don't know. I don't know if I could answer that for the whole MAV. Maybe Brock, you might have a feel for it, but you know, we're in a, you know, like 28 WMAs and the MAV 30 WMAs that we manage this way.
Well, I don't know what agency folks we have on here, just not looking at all the names at one time, but from Mississippi, as far as their implementation, my impression from past experiences is that they are utilizing it, but just because of staff limitations and rate of reentry, you know, not as aggressively as they would like to. And I see Scott Baker on here. I don't know if you want to start any comments on that. Arkansas Game and Fish is definitely utilizing it. We're going to actually do this same type of virtual meeting with them in September. And one of their staff foresters is going to give us an update on how they're utilizing it specifically on state WMA. So I do know it's an integral part of what they're using. Obviously, with Martin being there, you know, they've really heavily integrated it, but I can't speak beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, just Louisiana, if you think of WMAs and refuges, it's probably, you know, around 30, you know, tracts of property in the MAV. And there's got to be at least, you know, 6 or 7 Arkansas Game and Fish, and then, you know, with refuges, 6 or 7 or 8, and in Mississippi, maybe, you know, maybe another 4 or 5 or 6. So I guess the answer might be in that, you know, high 30s, low 40s, maybe parcels of property that are managed like this, state or federal.
Hey, Duck and Steve, this is Scott Baker. Y'all are, you know, spot on with Mississippi. We, you know, the numbers that you're talking about is right in line with us. We have hired an additional forester, and with Carl Branson and Stan Free, so we are making a more of an effort statewide, but we will be focusing on some Delta WMAs too.
Great. Good to hear. All right, other questions? Good questions, good discussion. Well, hearing none, I think I'm gonna hand the mic back over to you, Mr. Bright.
All right, I think we're at a good place there. Again, as Steve said, I appreciate the robust discussion that we've had, and by all means, keep the conversation going with a follow-up question to myself or Brock or something, and we'll work towards getting them answered. It's no doubt that this material is what we like to spend our time on, other than what we're tasked with at times. So, Duck, we appreciate your efforts and the work that you put into bringing the presentation to the group today, and Steve for moderating that discussion, and the membership for participating. Not sure, Steve, do you have a number of participants with us?
The high point was 49.
49. Okay. What we have with us right now here at the end?
Yep.
36.
Okay.
And there were still 40 at 11:30.
Good deal. Good deal. Not definitely a worthwhile project. We're spending time doing this. It's always great to connect with this group, and being able to focus on delivery of wildlife habitat in the region that we operate. So again, thanks everybody. If you have follow-up questions, send them to myself or Steve. We can keep the conversation going, and we will we'll do that. But we appreciate you spending time with us today. Keep your ear to the ground on announcements for the training. I've received email this morning while we've been on the call from the Forest Stewards Guild. Keep an eye out for those announcements from them, because they will be taking a lead role in coordinating those workshops, and there'll be one in each of the 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas, in the coming months. And then also we will have a December meeting of some kind. It may be in this same format for this group, or let's hold out hope that some things change and get freed up and we'll be able to get together once again. So